China deliberately erased an entire maritime empire from the pages of history, and the secret they were hiding has the power to completely transform how you view the modern conflicts in the South China Sea. Just picture the scene: a massive, hulking Chinese treasure ship drops anchor at a lush tropical island. The captain of this vessel, a man who commands naval fleets that dwarf anything existing in Europe at the time, steps onto the sand and bows respectfully before the local rulers, not the other way around. This is not a fantasy novel, this is a historical reality that repeated itself for over 1,000 years, yet China desperately attempted to scrub it from the record. What you are about to discover will fundamentally shatter everything you thought you knew about Asian history. While your history textbooks were busy focusing entirely on the Silk Road, they conveniently left out the single most powerful trade route in medieval history. This route was not controlled by the superpowers of China or India, but by a scattered collection of island kingdoms that would eventually become the Philippines. Today, we are exposing a secret that empires spent centuries trying to bury, so stay with me, because this rabbit hole goes much deeper than you can imagine. In 1987, a group of simple fishermen off the coast of Butuan in the Philippines made an archaeological discovery that would shake the very foundations of Asian history. Buried deep in the mud, they found ancient boats, but these were not just any ordinary fishing vessels. They were massive Balangay ships, perfectly preserved in the earth for over 1,000 years. When archaeologists finally carbon dated these vessels, they were stunned to find they dated back to 320 AD. But what really shocked the scientific community was the construction technique. It was so advanced that it predated similar Chinese and Arab shipbuilding methods by centuries. But the boats were just the beginning of the mystery. If this part of history blew your mind, hit the like button, share your reaction in the comments, and subscribe to the channel with bell notifications turned on so you don't miss the truth. In the 1970s, workers digging in the Laguna province uncovered something even more extraordinary: the Laguna copperplate inscription. This thin, corroded sheet of copper, dated specifically to the year 900 AD, contained writing in a complex mix of Old Malay, Sanskrit, and Old Javanese. When scholars finally translated the text, they discovered something incredible. It was a legal document, specifically a debt forgiveness notice that mentioned multiple kingdoms, intricate trade agreements, and a sophisticated legal system. This proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that this was not some primitive society living in huts. This was a complex, interconnected network of kingdoms engaged in high-level international commerce. And then came the Surigao treasure. Over 1,000 pounds of solid gold artifacts were discovered, including the famous golden Agusan image, which depicts a figure that scholars believe represents a local deity or ruler. The craftsmanship of these items rivaled, and in some cases exceeded, anything found in mainland Asia at the time. This brings us to the question nobody could answer. Here is what puzzled historians: if the pre-colonial Philippines was so advanced and wealthy, why don't our history books talk about it? Why does every Asian history course focus exclusively on China, India, and Japan, while treating the Philippines as if it was a cultural backwater that only became important when Magellan arrived in 1521? The answer is chilling, because powerful empires spent centuries trying to erase this history to suit their own narratives. Geography is destiny, and if you look at a map of Asia, really look at it, you will see that the Philippines sits at the absolute crossroads of everything. To the north lie China, Korea, and Japan. To the west, India and the Middle East via the Malay Peninsula. To the south, the Spice Islands of Indonesia. And to the east, the vast Pacific Ocean. But here is the crucial part everyone misses. In the age of sailing ships, you couldn't just sail in a straight line. You had to follow the monsoon winds and ocean currents. And those currents all passed directly through Philippine waters. The northeast monsoon brought Chinese and Japanese ships south, while the southwest monsoon carried Indian and Arab traders east. The Philippines wasn't just along the road, it was the road. Between 900 and 1500 AD, the Philippines wasn't a single kingdom, but dozens of powerful city-states called Quedachuans and Rajanets. In northeastern Mindanao, the Rajanate of Butuan controlled access to the Pacific, and their Balangay ships were known as the finest in Asia. Chinese Song Dynasty records called them consummate shipbuilders, noting that these vessels could carry 90 tons of cargo and travel 5,000 miles without stopping. Then, there was Maritime. Chinese records from 972 AD describe Maritime as a major trading power. Chinese merchants would arrive with porcelain, silk, and bronze, and they would leave with Philippine gold, pearls, cotton, and exotic woods. But here is the key takeaway: the Chinese had to trade on Philippine terms, not their own. In the Manila Bay area, Tondo and Namayan controlled the entrance to the Pasig River system, the highway into Luzon's interior, meaning nothing moved north or south without going through them. Further south, the Sultanate of Sulu controlled the southern seas, acting as the gatekeepers between the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. Everyone forgets what made these kingdoms powerful wasn't just their location. It was what they controlled. The Philippines had some of the richest gold deposits in all of Asia. Spanish conquistadors would later write in their journals that they saw more gold in the Philippines than in Mexico or Peru. Where did it all go? Chinese records show massive gold imports coming from Luzon. Then there were the pearls. Philippine pearls were legendary, appearing in Chinese imperial courts and Middle Eastern palaces. They also traded exotic goods like beeswax, cotton, civet musk, birds' nests, medicinal plants, and hardwoods, items that Chinese and Arab elites would pay fortunes for. But the ultimate commodity was information. Because everyone passed through their waters, Philippine traders knew the prices in China, India, Arabia, and Java. They knew which goods were scarce and where. They were the information brokers of medieval Asia. Here is where the story gets really interesting. Chinese records from the Song Dynasty and the Ming Dynasty are filled with references to Philippine kingdoms. But there is something odd about these records. The Chinese always describe themselves as the Middle Kingdom, the center of civilization, superior to all others. Yet, when they wrote about the Philippines, the tone was different, respectful, almost cautious. Why? Because Chinese merchants needed the Philippines more than the Philippines needed China. A Chinese text from 1225 AD describes trade with Mai, stating that the Chinese merchants must follow the customs of Mai. The local rulers set the prices, and the Chinese do not dare to cheat them, for the people of Mai are skilled in trade and know the value of Chinese goods better than the Chinese themselves. Read that again. The Chinese didn't dare cheat Filipino traders because the Filipinos knew the Chinese markets better than the Chinese did. The Philippine kingdoms developed what historians now call a prestige goods system. They didn't mass-produce cheap items, they focused on high-value goods that couldn't be found elsewhere, creating perpetual demand. Chinese emperors wanted Philippine gold for their treasuries, Japanese nobles wanted Philippine pearls, Indian merchants wanted exotic woods, and Arab traders wanted spices that grew nowhere else. And here is the genius part: the Philippine kingdoms never became dependent on any single trading partner. If China imposed unfair terms, they would simply trade more with the Arabs. If the Arabs tried to monopolize routes, they would strengthen ties with Java or Japan. This multi-directional trade network made them virtually impossible to conquer economically. So why did China hide the truth? When the Ming Dynasty came to power in 1368, they faced a problem. China had just overthrown Mongol rule and needed to restore Han Chinese pride. The narrative had to be clear: China is the center of civilization, and all other nations are tributaries, subordinate states that depend on Chinese favor. But the Philippine kingdoms didn't fit this narrative. They were independent trading powers that dealt with China as equals, sometimes even from a position of strength. So, Ming historians did something subtle but devastating. They began rewriting the records. Philippine kingdoms were described as tribute-bearing states, even though the trade was mutual and beneficial to both sides. The language changed from trade partners to barbarians seeking Chinese civilization. However, archaeological evidence tells a different story. Excavations in the Philippines have found Chinese porcelain, yes, but also Arabian glass, Indian beads, and Vietnamese ceramics. These weren't gifts from a benevolent empire, this was international commerce. When the Spanish arrived in 1521, they expected to find primitive villages. Instead, they found fortified cities, literate rulers, and sophisticated legal systems. Miguel López de Legazpi, who led the Spanish conquest, wrote in 1565 that these islands are more populous and richer than they imagined. He noted that the natives possess much gold and engage in trade with China, Japan, and other nations, and that they have laws and write in their own script. But here is what is crucial: the Spanish had a vested interest in portraying the pre-colonial Philippines as primitive. Why? Because it justified their conquest and conversion efforts. If the Philippines was already civilized and wealthy, what was the moral justification for colonization? So, Spanish chronicles emphasized the aspects they could civilize: religion and governance structure, while downplaying the commercial sophistication they encountered. When Western universities began studying Asian history in the 19th and early 20th centuries, they relied heavily on Chinese and Spanish sources. Both had reasons to minimize Philippine importance. The narrative became that China was the center, India contributed religion and culture, and Southeast Asia was a passive recipient of both. The Philippines got reduced to a footnote, discovered by Magellan, colonized by Spain, and unimportant until the Americans arrived.